All right, well, good morning, welcome to this rainy, although slightly overcast now day. My name is Dr. Jason Myers, I'm a professor of New Testament at Greensboro College, just around the corner. And I'm glad to be with you this week. Apologies for last week. I woke up Saturday with a pretty scratchy voice, and by Saturday afternoon, my voice was shot completely. And as I joke with people, my career doesn't require me to be in the peak physical shape. I can teach with a broken leg, I can teach with a fever, but if I don't have my voice, that's kind of the one thing that's kind of needed in my line of work. And so I heard Donna had the same thing, so it's been going around. Whoever else stays healthy. So I'm glad to be back this week. I'm sorry our time will be cut short just a little bit, and so we will have to move quickly through the Gospel of Mark. So I have been here in Greensboro since 2015, so about 8 years now. My wife and I moved here from Kentucky, where I finished my PhD in New Testament under Ben Witherington, and we have lived here for 8 years. I taught at the college for all 8 of those years, and about 5 years, 6 years ago, started teaching in the UK as well. So I have an appointment here and then one at a school called WTC Theology, which is a small theological college in England. So I'll actually be heading there on December 1st. Or sorry, January 1st. I did by 9 days. No, awful. No, January 1st. So we have 2 small children, my wife and I, August, who turned 4 in September, and our daughter Phoebe, who turned 2 in June. So she's about 2.5 now. So our lives are busy. When I'm not reading about the New Testament, I'm usually watching Paw Patrol with the kids, or it's very non-academic, but there's overlaps. It's a very interesting narrative world. If you're constructed. But yeah, we have a lot of fun. We love being here in Greensboro, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. So we're going to be walking through the Gospel of Mark in about 2 weeks, which is no small feat. Although I recently did the entire Bible in 4 weeks, so there should be plenty of time. We did a very quick whistle-stop tour through the story of Scripture. So Mark in 2 weeks should be okay. It is the shortest gospel by word count, so that's going to help me out. It's like we're trying to do Luke or something. But I'm really excited to do this. My degree is in New Testament, but I focus primarily on the Apostle Paul. But I like to say I can dabble with Jesus. I love teaching on the Gospels, but primarily I'm a Paul guy. But I love the Gospel of Mark for a lot of different reasons. One, as you're reading through, right, this text through this Advent season, Mark presents us with a very startling picture of Jesus. A very quick narrative, a narrative that doesn't let up, right, where we're moving very quickly through the story. And so what I want to do kind of in the next 2 weeks is kind of situate who is Mark, why is he writing, what are some of his major themes of this work, to kind of narrate our time together as we think through Mark's call to us in this Advent season of looking at disruptions. And I think the best place to begin is perhaps with the disruption that began in perhaps Mark's own life, or the group of people around Mark, as they sat down to write this gospel. If we take the church tradition seriously, Mark is considered to be by the early church fathers and mothers the secretary, the memoirist of the Apostle Peter. And so the Gospel of Mark, I believe it was Papias who said he wrote down Peter's memories. He was kind of his right-hand man in that sense, and started to collect the stories of Peter. If you've ever read through the Gospel of Mark, it might start to make some sense that Peter is a very central character in the story, not just in all the Gospel accounts, but especially in Mark, right? This is the person who walks on water. This is the person who has the great declaration, you are the Messiah, Son of the living God. This is the person who also denies Jesus 3 times, right? So these are stories with a Petrine kind of focus, Petrine center. And that disruption that perhaps first began the writing of these stories was unexpected. We believe that the Gospel of Mark was written somewhere in the year 60-ish. It's probably the first gospel. And I always find it interesting that we are about 3 decades after Jesus before we get our first kind of official kind of text, right? Of a story of Jesus. There are other stories circulating around at the time. If you go over to Luke's gospel, right? In Luke 1, Luke says, there are many have undertaken to write an account of the life of Jesus. And so he said there are other people writing stories of Jesus. We believe Mark is the first, and I'll spare you the kind of nerdy reason how we get there. But the reason why they write, I think, is fascinating. As they're writing in the 60s, they're finding that these stories of Jesus are captured with the apostles, the people who were there, who were at the feeding of 5,000, who saw Jesus teach, saw him heal someone. And as the church continues to grow in its length and in its duration, they face some challenges. The people who have those stories are getting older, and those stories need to be written down. We think for the first 30 years, the stories of Jesus circulated through oral tradition. They were told from one person to the next, for the very simple reason that a lot of people who experienced those stories were still very much alive. And like today, I don't know about you, we'd rather go see the play than read the book, right? We would rather experience those things in person because it's more powerful, right? So if we think about the first Gospels, they really were stories that were collected by Peter, Mark, James, John, people who had been with Jesus over various times. And so when the church tradition says that Mark was the one who wrote down Peter's stories, there's a sense of we need to get these stories captured, because if the people die, the stories die with them, right? A lot of our family histories are probably told in a very similar way. I don't know about your families, but my families are not making history books, which could be a good thing. And so all the stories of my grandparents and my great-grandparents are told down the family line. This is how much of human history has worked before we could, start recording things, right? And so the stories of Jesus were then told by word of mouth. They were told from one person to the next. And so if you picture Peter, who perhaps may be in Rome at the time, if Peter's in Rome and the church is gathering, in those first couple of decades, they're probably under a couple hundred people. When it comes time for the gospel reading, they don't turn to a text, they turn to an apostle, right? They probably have their psalm reading and their Hebrew Bible reading from the scroll. When it came time for the story of Jesus, they got to hear it straight from the mouth of the person who was there, which had to be a very powerful experience. If you can imagine Peter saying, there was this one time where we walked into this house and Jesus was there and he began teaching. This is how these stories function, but as the church grows, as time continues on, as it does, these apostles start dying off, just simply from old age. A small level of persecution begins to arise. Sometimes people are taken out. And so the idea, because we need to write these gospel stories down, because the stories need to be told to more generations. And so Mark's role here in this is to begin to collate really Peter's stories, his memories, as the church fathers call them, to pass along the story. Now Mark is going to put his footprint on the story, or his fingerprints will be all over it, in the sense that all gospels, as we think about not lingering cough from last week, as we think about stories, right, they all require some level of selection and editing. If you think about your own life, someone says, hey, how was your day today? You immediately don't think about this, but your brain has to go into overdrive and immediately has to start selecting out important events. And that's a choice that your brain has to make. So you can't say, well, I woke up at 6:35 a.m., put my right foot out of bed, and I'm like, no, I don't have that. Yeah. I can't be with the date. You might know people who tell stories like that. All right. But I got in a car accident, or I had an argument, or this gift came in the mail, or these are the high points, right? And so when Mark goes to tell the stories of Peter, he's got to make choices. And so the way that this story is told is very much Mark's telling. And you probably have grasped that if you've ever read the Gospel of Mark. There are, in Greek, 32 instances of this word immediately. That gives a very quick, fast-paced narrative. You kind of hurtle through Mark at top speed. You almost can't catch your breath as you work your way through the story. And that seems to be Mark's very direct storytelling. Mark also, I think, has a very significant role in that he sets a standard for what is to come. And this is going to be controversial later on in church history, is that what we get is a story of Jesus' life. We get a narrative. These aren't just random sayings of Jesus. They're not just random collections of his tweets, right? But these are a story that you enter into: characters, plot, action. And it's from there that we think Matthew, Luke, and John modeled their stories off of Peter's. Off of Mark's. That he set down that we're going to introduce you to a story, a narrative about someone's life. If we think about the Gospel of Mark in the ancient world, what is fascinating is that there are lots of stories like these. One of the closest analogies we have in the ancient world is a tradition known as biography writing. But these were usually reserved for the most famous of people in the Roman world. Your Caesars, your emperors, your generals, your Roman senators, the people who made a mark on history. It was their stories that were told, mainly so that you could begin to emulate their life, right? If you want to improve your life, well, start doing, to the degree that you can, the same things that Emperor Augustus did. Well, nice try. I can't do all those things. But there's this genre of writing about famous people. And so when the gospel writers begin to write the story of Jesus, I think they reach for this style of writing, which is all the more fascinating that we have, from an ancient perspective, a minor religious figure and a minor ethnic community on the far flungs of the Roman Empire. I mean, this is out in the middle of nowhere. A pastor who's preaching, all of a sudden, we're writing famous stories about his life. This is unusual in the ancient world. For the simple fact that to write a story, we all have the ability to open up an iPad or a laptop and begin writing, right? In the ancient world, this was costly. You had to make paper. You had to make the ink. On top of that, you actually had to know how to read and write. Two things that were not entirely given. And so the task that the gospel writers in Mark are up for is one that is, I think, costly, and one that begins to set out a way of thinking about the story of Jesus that will come to have repercussions for how everyone talks about the story of Jesus. And many have reflected that this story element is perhaps one of the most deeply human aspects of life, is that we think in story. If you go back to someone, to the illustration I had earlier about how if someone asks you about your day, you probably tell them a story. You don't give them an itemized list of timestamps and GPS locations, right? That'd be a very boring way of recounting your day, but you tell someone a story. If someone meets you and they say, "Who are you?" You probably do the same thing. You tell them a story, right? And with selection and editing. And so as we think about Mark's account here, it's interesting to see where he begins his story. It's interesting to see how he takes Peter's memoirs and collects them down in this. I realize I'm not going to my PowerPoint. Technically, it's there. I'm like, oh, yeah, that is there. We have anonymous compositions. So the oldest copies of the manuscript we have actually don't have names attached to them. And this is actually not all that peculiar, because when there are no gospels plural, you don't need to distinguish, right? So we come in on Sunday morning and we have a gospel reading, we have to say, well, which one are we reading? We got 4 options, right? Back in the day, that was not the problem that they had. So we said, read the gospel. There was only Mark's at one point. Or there, if you were in Ephesus, for example, there was only John's. So there was no need to differentiate. The only time we can see titles attaching them are early in the 2nd century, so right after the turn of 100. And the titles start getting attached because now when you go over to the bookshelf for the gospel reading, you have a question. If you have multiple gospels, and the question is, which one, right? Which is a question we're familiar with. The ones in the ancient world, they were not. And so these 2nd century attestations, as we call them, start attaching authors to books. Now, one of the things that you'll find fascinating if you want to go be a nerd is that these titles, although they are debated on who is this Mark, who is this Luke, are these accurate? What I found particularly fascinating is that the titles never get mixed up. We have 0 examples of someone misidentifying Luke's gospel for Mark's gospel, or John's gospel for Matthew's. They may debate like which Matthew was it, which Johannes, which John was it. But what I find fascinating is that they never mix up the stories. They always know this is always Mark. This is always John. So 0 examples of wrong. Now they might just not have names attached to them. That's another difficulty. But it is fascinating. These names appear to be tied to a pretty strong tradition, at least, that it's some sort of Mark. Now, what I find funny when we talk about names is that, the names of our authors are rather common, right? John is a pretty common name. Mark or Marcus, he's Latin, was a pretty common name. So like today, there's a lot of debate on who exactly these people were. I think that the Mark that wrote Mark's gospel is what we call a 2nd generation Christian, and that he wasn't part of the story. He kind of came later. He might be a traveler, the Mark that we meet in the book of Acts, known as John Mark. But these things are usually highly conjectured, and I find them actually rather kind of boring. It's interesting, but we're never going to know with full certainty. This was the quote that I should have showed you. This is Papias on Mark's gospel. He says this, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in the exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for neither he, the Lord, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to his hearers, but it with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. So basically, Papias says, Mark came in, had the stories, and put them in a narrative framework, and said, here's how one story is going to relate to the next. And a lot of the stories of Jesus don't necessarily have a chronological element to them, I'll put it that way, right? As I joke with my students, right, the ancients aren't walking around with little sundials on their wrists, right? Time is very Einstein, right? It's all relative. And that if you notice in the gospel, a few days later, Jesus did this. Yeah, it's not minute. Yeah.
Pardon my ignorance, but who is Papias? And why is he an authority on whether or not this Mark was the Mark?
Yeah, so Papias and people like the other church fathers are just that first generation after the apostles. And so just in terms of like simple history taking, we would take the sources that are closest to the time of the event as at least perhaps more authoritative. That if anyone was going to know, it might be these guys. Again, we hold that kind of loosely. This is the best and earliest groups that we have talking about authorship. Because again, when Mark actually puts, stylus to papyrus here, no one's questioning who wrote the text. They're like, well, it's that guy. It's just from the back room, right? It's Mark. He's one of us, right? It's only after that, as the church grows, they go, okay, who wrote that? Because that old tradition then gets secured. So we just take it as some of the first historical witnesses to people talking about who that might be. And for certain groups, that relates to accuracy or authenticity. It doesn't have to, but it's a very interesting historical kind of insight into those first generations after the people who were with Jesus. So these are all the kind of 2nd generation. Great question. So as we think about this, we usually date, as I said, Mark's gospel to the 60s. And to speak of disruptions again, right? I think that first disruption was in the life of Mark. There's a little bit of a debate on whether or not Mark wrote before or after Peter died. When is that? Church history again is a little, it's hard to pin down of when Peter died. But what's fascinating about this is that disruption would have been the loss of someone significant in the life of the community. That would have been one of the reasons that we need to tell these stories. The other issue for dating, which gets really fascinating, is that the early church in Rome experiences at least a small level of persecution after the fires of Nero in the 60s. Nero, what would say that? That's a big discussion. He's associated with fires of fun. It's certain, FYI, it's a different, you've heard that. Fine, he's not playing his violin over all Rome burns. He's actually, no. But if this text is written somewhere in the 60s, the early church itself perhaps went through its own disruption, and that many people in the community may have experienced a profound level of suffering in the 60s. This is where we get those stories of after Rome burns, it's this group of Christians that are blamed for it, according to the Roman historian Suetonius. Which is fascinating because if it's in the 60s, within 30 years, this Jesus following group goes from unnamed to a group that can be kind of pointed at. So it's that, right? And everyone goes, oh yeah, we know Christians. And this is in a city of about 1 million people at the time. Rome is the first city that had 1 million people in the first century. The next cities that hit 1 million people will be, in Western Europe, will be Victorian era London. So you have 1 million people in the first century in Rome, nosedive. You don't get 1 million people in an urban setting until London. So this is a big city, to put it mildly. So the fact that Suetonius can say, or Nero can say, I want to blame the Christians, and everyone goes, oh yeah, we know who that is. I think points to their size in the community. But the reason why I bring this up is that the other idea for the dating of Mark is that this may have come, or this may have been written right after the Neronian persecution, which was localized in Rome. And one of the reasons we think this is that Mark's gospel, more than any other gospel, highlights the role of suffering. And this may be reflective of where the community is at. This may be a document that's meant to encourage a beleaguered community that is either about to or has just gone through a period of intense suffering. And we get some pretty gnarly stories out of the first century of how human bodies were treated by the Roman Empire, and how they were dismembered, how they were filleted, how they were lit on fire. And so Mark's gospel makes it, goes out of his way that suffering is part of what it means to follow Jesus. We'll look at this by a little bit either later today or next week, but suffering becomes kind of a calling card, if you will. Not a failure, but a faithful following of Jesus. So this doesn't count you out, this actually counts you in for the movement. So for a group that has experienced the disruption of persecution, Mark's gospel might come as a healing word in that sense, that you are suffering just like Jesus did. And that is actually part of his vindication, was it not? But was at the time of his failure, the cross turned things upside down, and that suffering now becomes a saving, right? And so as Mark's community is working through this, they're reading stories and they're hearing stories about a suffering Messiah. And so that's another way I think Mark has kind of put his fingerprints on it. He's got to highlight something about the story of Jesus. If you remember in John's gospel, he famously says, kind of hyperbolically, of course, that there aren't enough books in the world to write down all that Jesus said and did, which I'm sure it's true, but also points to the fact that all of our gospel writers are saying, okay, how do we begin to capture the charisma, the teaching, the personality of this figure? That is a pretty big task, you know. I love reading biographies just as like a side discipline, and I always find it remarkable. One, how well people document their lives. I'm like, that's how I know I'm never going to be famous. So like, I don't have that level of documentation. They have like video recordings when they were like 8. I'm like, oh, my documentaries would be very slim. But also like the ability to capture and get to know someone's life through writing is a very difficult task. And so if you think about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and some of the other writers, they're not slouches. They are, I think, literary geniuses in their own right for the stories that they tell and how they capture our imaginations, right? There are things that we still hear and say and do that are reflective of those worlds. So we think this text was written to a community again in Rome, most likely. That puts at least two gospels, I would argue, Luke and Mark going to Rome, John going to Ephesus, and Matthew most likely going to Jerusalem. Those are kind of the main headquarters, if you will, of the early Jesus movement in the first century. As we think about Mark's gospel, it's actually rather simple in that. So he starts first, and he gets to create the wheel, if you will. And it's really two big parts. And this is in my students' exam. This was an easy one. Right, there's Mark 1-8, and then really Mark 9-16. Two halves of Mark's gospel, with a watershed kind of turning point moment in chapter 8, right smack dab in the middle, where we have this confession of Peter, where he says, "You are Jesus, famous, right? Who people say that I am." And Peter, for a moment, correctly notes, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus gives him his gold star for the day. And Peter probably wishes that moment would have ended there. It doesn't, right? Within about 10 seconds flat, right? He says, "You're never going to die." And Jesus has some words for him. It goes on. He gets called Satan, which is always a bad day if that happens to you. From that, especially if Jesus telling you that. It's one thing, it's some random person, but or your Starbucks employee. No, I'm just kidding. But it's Jesus. All right, so chapters 1-8 and then chapters 9-16, all pivoting on this declaration of Jesus' identity. And so others, more scholarly than I have said that Mark 1-8 is all about answering the question, who is the Messiah? What's his identity? So Mark 1-8 is all about, in some ways, documenting these activities that Jesus is doing, his teaching, his healings, that are meant for an ancient audience, teacher in here, to mark him out as a Messiah. One of the big things that comes up is Jesus' ability to forgive sins. It's a really controversial point in Mark's world. So that comes up in Mark 1-8. The healing is meant to signify God's power at work through someone, right? Are part of Mark 1-8. This all shifts in chapter 8, verse 29 at this kind of key, this kind of hinge moment, where if Peter answers who the Messiah is, right? Jesus, you are the Messiah. That fills in that blank. Chapters 9-16 begins to unpack how will Jesus be the Messiah, or what does it mean for Jesus to be the Messiah? And here's where we get, starting in chapter 8, 9, and 10, 3 different conversations between Jesus and his disciples on what it means for him to be the Messiah. And what Jesus ends up teaching on in really chapters 8-10 on his way down to Jerusalem for his death is that he is a Messiah who's going to suffer and die. And this is a non-starter for Mark, for the apostles, maybe even for Mark's audience, and I would argue even today, this is a difficult word to be given about who Jesus is. This is not the Jesus we want, right? This is not the Messiah we want. The term Mashiach that Jesus is called, right, is not a Greek title. Christos is a Greek title, but it's Mashiach, which is Hebrew, which means anointed one. And it refers to all those people you find in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, who had oil poured over their heads. If you remember the Old Testament a little bit, it's usually kings, right? Think of the stories of Samuel anointing Saul and David, right? And what is that doing? That oil is a symbol, right? It's signifying God's empowering kind of official selection of that person to be an agent of deliverance for the people, right? So this is who God has marked out as his own. Do some baptismal liturgy there. To be the one in and whom through rescue and redemption will come. In the Hebrew Bible, right, typically those kings are also military figures, right? So they're anointed not just to rescue people, but to lead them in a political way as a king. And so when Jesus is called the Mashiach, the anointed one of Yahweh, this carries some overtones. As I mentioned, it's a job that comes, sorry, it's a title that comes with the job description, already attached, already filled out. This is what you are going to do. So chapters 8 through 16 of Mark then begin to really subversively and disruptively unpack and unwind and rebuild this term from the inside out. Because when you throw out the term Mashiach, you're throwing out military political language in Jesus' day. And so Jesus, with his disciples, has to kind of retool that and say, the type of Messiah that I'm going to be, the person in whom God is working through, is someone who's going to suffer and die on behalf of his enemies, not conquer them, but rather be conquered by them in the story. And it's here where the disciples kind of lose their minds a little bit on what did we sign up for? And as you read through Mark's gospel, I've always found it funny, whether it's in preaching or in reading or just in popular discourse, that the disciples get a lot of, let's say, flack for not getting it, right? For being the disciples, right? You don't remember it, right? I don't know if that's accurate in some ways, because I think in a very unnerving way, what if they did get it? What if they actually did understand and were so distraught at the implications that they had to find another way? So this is why in chapter 8, when Peter declares Jesus to be the Messiah, and he says, I'm going to die, Peter says, may it never be. That's never going to happen. And Jesus calls him Satan. Right? So he said, Jesus says, here's who I am. Here's what it means to be the Messiah. Peter says, no way. The next time they have this discussion, they're on the road with Jesus, and James and John are arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And they actually have their mom, which I think is amazing, to go and ask the question, which is just brilliant, right? And what mother did not advocate for their children for the very best, right? The story is so realistic, it's not even funny, but also kind of funny in that James and Mark just can't get the gumption to go up to Jesus and ask for himself, which is just a really hard thing. We know how kingdoms operate. How do we get to be the second kingdom? How do we climb that ladder? And Jesus says, in my kingdom, it's not about climbing the ladder, it's about descending. And they get really upset at that. And so they say they didn't really ask any more questions. Don't go on that one. And so this idea of Jesus' kingship, this idea of Jesus' messiahship, we often think of Messiah in this very like spiritualized way, that a Messiah is some sort of like Bible thing, right? It really is just another term for king. If you know Jesus is the king and you have a kingdom, right? So when Jesus talks about his messiahship, he's talking about what type of king he wants to be. As I mentioned, those things come with a job description. If you say you're king, you automatically have to tell, well, how are you going to rule the kingdom? How are you going to let people in and out of the kingdom? What do you do with those people who are at odds with the kingdom, the enemies? How do you treat people who are outside the kingdom? Notice these are all the conversations that come up in Jesus' teaching. And at each turn, he has this upside down, subversive way of being a king. This is a king who accepts the lonely, the lost, the least, the people who have nothing to give, and actually disregards people of worth and says, this might be very difficult for you. It pulls in people who are outsiders, and it seeks to inculcate this kingdom of the upside down way of God. This leads to conflict and controversy. This is not the type of king we want, but yet this is the type of king on offer from Mark, the king that suffers and dies. And this is where, when we come back to the disciples, I wonder, when we say that, I think that they got it. Jesus has a lot of interesting sayings where he says, if you want to follow me, take up your cross, right? Be prepared to die. And I think the disciples go, okay, what are we supposed to learn from this, right? If the part of being a disciple, the term Mathetes in Greek simply means student or learner. And Jesus is talking about dying. He's the teacher. What do we take from that? What are we supposed to learn? And then Jesus is very starting with things like, well, take up your cross. Be prepared to lose your life. And at these points, the disciples start to get confused. They start to get angry. They start to get frustrated because they might be thinking, well, I thought I was attached to the king for all of the benefits, right? That I'm part of the royal entourage and things are going to go well in my life. And he says, well, maybe not here. And at this point, I think we can begin to maybe explain one of those disciples who doesn't stick it out, Judas. That as he gets attached to the story of Jesus, he's going to be a king, he's going to rule the people. Judas latches on, and then all of a sudden these conversations don't stop. And maybe Judas realizes at some point that Jesus is talking about a metaphor here for his life. He's actually going to die. And it's at this point that Judas may be the type of person who kind of pulls the parachute cord and says, I'm out, right? Because this isn't what I signed up for. I signed up for a victorious military king, and that's not what you're offering me. And so I might as well make a little bit of money on the way out. That's the worst version of it. He may be saying nobly that I think you're the wrong king. And so you better be out of the way so that someone else can take your place. So Judas is wrapped up in this story of disillusionment and unfulfilled expectations. So it shows how all the different gospel writers begin to interact with who Jesus is. And some say this isn't what we signed up for. This is why Jesus at various places will have to say, will you depart me too? Will you move out? And we see this throughout these stories. So Mark tells the story again to begin to narrate this life of Jesus. Again, it's very simple, even geographically. The first 8 chapters are all in northern Galilee and northern Israel. We have a journey to Jerusalem, chapters 8 through 10, and then the second half of the gospel is set all in Jerusalem in the weeks leading up to Jesus' death. Mark has been called a passion story with an extended introduction. He dedicates 50% of his material to the final weeks of Jesus' life, and the first roughly 3 years take up the other 50%. So that's where you can begin to see him as an author allocating timeline, plotline, stories, right, to particular spaces. He's making choices. He doesn't just narrate this way. He said, I want to spend more time on the final weeks of Jesus' life and less time on the beginning. Clearly showing, where the story is going is rather important, right? But you can see his work as an author in doing this. And here is where it becomes fascinating because Mark goes first, right? Matthew and Luke adopt this framework. John was the only outlier, but John's an outlier in many ways. But Matthew and Luke simply carry this over wholesale from Mark. So he really does, in some ways, to use the term again, disrupt the gospel writing process, and that he sets this kind of new standard here for how the story will be told. We already mentioned this, but within Mark's gospel, time moves rather quickly. 42 times in 16 chapters. That's over twice every chapter. We get the word immediately. And it really is Mark's kind of literary lake to move this story quickly. He takes this story and he kind of turns up the speed with a simple word, which is a great literary tool to create narrative pacing, right, in your story. You're just kind of being pushed in from one room to the next before you can kind of get your bearings on what just happened. All of a sudden, another scene is unfolding before you. Mark loves to describe stories. What's fascinating is that Mark's stories are usually twice as long as the same story in Matthew and Luke. So there's a bunch of stories that Matthew, Mark, and Luke share together. And if you've ever read through Matthew, Mark, and Luke in a row, you might be like, oh, a little repetitive. Because you see the same stories again, but Mark gives us the longer versions of the stories. He has a lot to say about how he tells those stories there. He also likes to do, and this is great right before early lunch or brunch. He also has what's called Marking sandwiches, which is a fun, that's an actual phrase you can read in a textbook. I didn't make that up. And that he'll intersperse stories. So he'll start a story interrupt it, and then come back to it at the end. And it seems to be part of his kind of literary creation. Again, I think what this does is it builds tension in the story. It's like when you're watching a TV show or a movie and the plot line is, you're like, I need to know, what did he say? And then the scene cuts to another scene. You're just waiting to resolve what happened. Right? The author is helping you get kind of anxious, right, for what's going to happen. Mark does this throughout his gospel. He ADAs his stories. He'll start one, stop it, come back. And again, as he tells the story, it's a really creative way to get us as the audience, like on the edge of our seats, like what's going to happen. One of those famous stories where he does this sandwich technique is the cursing of the fig tree, the cleansing of the temple, and then the discussion of the fig tree. Remember the story from Mark 11? Jesus walks by and says some angry words at a tree, which has to be hilarious. Right? I don't know if you shout at trees, I know. But and it also says he was hungry, which is great. So when Jesus gets hungry, he also gets angry. How about you? Haven't had lunch, give that person a snack, they're gonna call him down, right? And so Jesus yells at the tree. Mark stops that story. We get a cleansing of the temple, where Jesus turns over the table, that famous story. And then Mark has Jesus and the disciples come back to the tree for Jesus to explain what he did. So we're sitting there going, why did Jesus just yell at a tree and curse it? We don't get the answer. We get another story, and then we get the summary. Now, what Mark has done, though, by this splicing story, is he wants us to see the story of the temple inside, literally, story of the fig tree. So the fig tree stands in the temple. And it's a great way of teaching. So take this image. I want you to interpret the scene in light of what Jesus just said about the fig tree. What's fascinating about that is he curses the fig tree for not having the fruit, the fig, that it's meant to have. It's not having the result, the intention that it's created to do, if you will. And then he has us walk through the temple, and we get a very similar thing. The temple was created for a purpose, for a reason. And in Jesus' day, he seems to say, it's not fulfilling its intended function. It's not doing what it was meant to do. It's not producing the type of persons it was meant to produce. And so Mark has this really great storytelling whereby he tells his stories in a particular way to do that. All right, it's about 10:46. We have a couple minutes. We'll kind of pause it there for this week. I know service starts till 11. Any questions kind of from this really wide view of who Mark is, what he's doing? Yeah.